Inside the burning house, a little girl's cries for help rang out. As soon as David heard them, he threw his bag aside and rushed towards the source of the sound. Thick smoke had already filled the small shack, but he didn't hesitate to push open the door and enter. Before him was a little girl tied up inside, sitting on an old chair. He immediately plunged into the flames and hastily untied her, telling her to hold her breath to avoid inhaling more toxic smoke. The fire grew larger, threatening to engulf everything. David mustered all his strength to get her out, but just as he was leaving the shack, he suddenly remembered his bag. The little girl curiously asked what was inside. He stammered that there was nothing. She said he was very brave. Hearing her praise, he smiled. It was the first time in a long time he had smiled again. Just then, the girl's mother approached and gently kissed David on the forehead to express her gratitude for saving her daughter. She promised to repay him with everything she had. The girl's parents also wanted to help contact David's family, but they asked around the area and no one knew who he was. David, however, adamantly refused to reveal any information about his family. The 12-year-old boy's identity became increasingly mysterious, causing the two to become suspicious. They repeatedly questioned him, wondering if he was lying. The familiar gestures of the man and his increasingly close demeanor brought back horrific memories from the past. Just a few days ago, David was over 1,000 kilometers away from here. The reformatory in Bulgaria was where he grew up. Every day he had to work hard until he was exhausted. Almost nothing good had ever happened to him. His young face was etched with weariness, to the point where he had forgotten how to smile. There were times when he even wanted to end his life. But whenever he faced difficulties, he always had a mentor named John. John always said that only by continuing to live could he change his fate. That's why David harbored the thought of escaping from that place. That night, his face was extremely tense. He listened to a man's instructions. Tonight was his only chance to escape. He had to follow all the directions to get out of the camp and take this sealed letter to Denmark. The journey would be extremely difficult, but he had to remember two things. First, the outside world was indeed vaster, but also full of dangers. He had to trust no one. Only then would he be safe. Second, he absolutely had to not open the letter beforehand. Otherwise, his life could be in danger at any moment. David engraved every word deep in his heart. When David groggily woke up, Teacher John was lying opposite him, seemingly nodding in acknowledgement. David understood that the time had come, and he followed the call from deep within him. He took the important letter and began his escape plan. Using the shadow of the truck to evade the strict guards, David approached the high-voltage electric fence. Seeing the signal light in the darkness indicated that the power would be cut off in 30 seconds. In that brief moment, he was forced to climb over the fence. He mustered all his courage, climbing despite the steel spikes cutting his skin. Just as he landed, the lights came back on. Before he could run far, the shouts of soldiers rang out behind him. He could only pray silently. When he turned around, he saw they were just arguing amongst themselves. They paid no attention to the boy hiding in the darkness. He quickly ran into the nearby forest. According to his plan, he had dug up the package hidden under a tree. Inside were a piece of bread, a small knife, a compass, and a bar of soap carrying a sad story. After gathering his belongings, he used the compass to determine his direction. In the silent, cold night, only the lonely figure of a boy remained, running headlong. Because tonight he had to escape Bulgaria. But a piece of bread was too little, not enough for an all-night escape. So when he saw a convoy of cars parked by the roadside, he seized the opportunity to hitch a ride. As soon as he climbed into the truck, he crawled into a deep corner of the cargo bed. Soon, exhausted, he drifted off to sleep. When he opened his eyes, it was already daylight. The truck was about to leave the border area. Just then, two soldiers unexpectedly came to inspect the vehicle. Seeing the soldiers in uniform in front of him, David's heart pounded with tension. He took advantage of their momentary distraction and jumped out of the truck. Thanks to this, he narrowly escaped danger. But the situation changed so quickly that he didn't dare stop. He had no choice but to keep running until nightfall. He only stopped when he reached the border. But this time he wasn't as lucky as before. The towering fence and constantly illuminated electric grid became a major obstacle blocking his path to freedom. Thanks to his strong survival instinct, he dug a small escape route under the fence, a glimmer of hope, but he was still spotted by the patrol soldiers. Just as the soldiers rushed towards him, he managed to crawl across the border. When he turned back, he saw the letter had fallen in the hole. In the midst of danger, he still went back to retrieve the letter. Between him and the guards, only a thin wire mesh separated them. Fortunately, they didn't dare fire into the other side. Under the flickering light of distant flares, David finally reached the first leg of his journey in Greece. Next, he had to cross the sea to Italy. He made his way to a nearby port. Taking advantage of everyone's inattention, he clung to the anchor rope, climbed onto the ship heading to Italy, and hid in a discreet cargo hold. His nerves were on edge, making it difficult to sleep. The mysterious letter became his only hope. Exhausted, he drifted off to sleep. In his dream, a mysterious woman smiled at him. Perhaps it was his mother from his hazy memories. But each time he woke up, he only saw the figure reminder of John, who had always been by his side, helping him overcome one challenge after another. David burst into tears, saying he couldn't do it and that he was sure he would be discovered. John smiled and replied that if David blended into the crowd and hid himself skillfully, he would definitely succeed. There were still places in this world full of kindness. Someday, you will come across places like that. Now it was his journey. The important thing was to maintain kindness and find freedom. But in the end, John was just a phantom in David's dreams. The next morning, he was awakened by a talkative sailor. Luckily, he had picked up a few languages in camp, so he could understand what the sailor was saying. The sailor said the ship did not harbor stowaways. Then he turned to report to his superiors to have him arrested. In his moment of crisis, David pulled out the small knife he carried with him. That Soviet-style knife delighted the sailor. Although he couldn't take the compass from David's hand, he still agreed to help David hide on the ship, on the condition that David leave before the ship docked. After a long voyage, the ship gradually approached the harbor. The sailor put a life jacket on David and lowered him into the sea with a rope. He said that the waves and tide would push David ashore. David said he wasn't afraid, but as a child who had never seen the sea, he still trembled with nervousness when he touched the salty water. Fortunately, the faith John had in David helped him keep swimming. A few days later, he woke up on shore. This place was completely different from the gloomy re-education camp in his memory. The open hillside and the emerald blue sea seemed to celebrate David's return to a new life. The weariness of his days of wandering seemed to vanish. For the first time, he bathed in the sun and took deep breaths of the free air to wash away the dust of his days on the run. Just then, a plane roared overhead. David panicked and quickly sought cover. He realized that his mission was still long ahead. Next, he had to head straight north. After some time, he arrived at a strange town. There were no soldiers in uniform, but the stares of the people around him made him uneasy. The words kept repeating in his head, "It's dangerous out here. Don't trust anyone." So he only dared to cautiously continue his journey. He walked along, looking for something to eat to stave off hunger. When he passed a bakery, the owner invited David in. Knowing that David didn't have money to buy bread, the owner didn't scold him harshly. He simply said that if David helped out, he would get bread to eat. The owner only set one condition: David had to always greet customers with a smile. This seemingly simple thing was incredibly difficult for a child who grew up in a camp like David. He had almost never smiled in his memories, so he didn't know how to smile. His face was completely stiff. The owner turned to the statue of Saint Elizabeth and lamented that there was a child in the world who didn't know how to smile. Then he gave David a picture of Saint Elizabeth. He hoped the patron saint of bread would protect David. After delivering the order, the owner told David to get some fresh bread. But as soon as he turned his back, he spoke to the policeman standing at the shop door. David became alert and immediately understood what was going on. David knew what the uniform meant when the owner brought the policeman into the shop. Seizing the opportunity, he dashed out and escaped the bakery. At this moment, his hunger was no longer his concern. He just ran without stopping. The painful memory, like a chain, bound him, deeply embedded in his heart, seemingly impossible to erase. After a while, exhausted, he ran into a deserted forest. His foot tripped and he rolled down a slope. He only stopped when he hit a tree trunk hard. The compass was thus completely broken. This made the road ahead even more difficult. Disoriented, David didn't know where to go. He was like a headless fly, circling aimlessly. He was trapped in that desolate place. He recalled dark memories he didn't want to talk about. Back then, an officer had gathered everyone in the camp just to find a missing bar of soap. He only vaguely remembered what happened afterward. The only sound that day was the clicking of a gun being loaded remained vividly in his mind. That memory jolted him awake from the present. He silently clasped his hands in prayer to Saint Elizabeth. He looked up at the distant sky. Unexpectedly, it was as if Saint Elizabeth had heard his prayer. David suddenly felt a vague sense of guidance. He slowly climbed a large tree. From above, he could see the way out of the forest. Then he continued his solitary journey. When he reached another town, he was stopped by a dog. Perhaps even the dog was annoyed by David's gloomy demeanor, so it barked and chased after him relentlessly. Reluctantly, he climbed a high wall. Unexpectedly, in this misfortune, there was a stroke of luck. At that moment, the old woman who owned the dog appeared and chased it away. Thus, David escaped. Then, the kind old woman gave him a basket of wine and asked him to take it to the farm ahead. She handed him 2 coins as his wages. He heard there was a bonus, so he ran quickly to complete his assigned task. Looking at the lively party on the farm, he could hardly believe such a beautiful life could exist. But the landlady didn't like a perpetually gloomy child like David, so he turned and walked away dejectedly. On the way, he picked up a broken piece of mirror. He just wanted to see if his face was really so unpleasant that people disliked him. Not far ahead was a small shop. David looked at the mirror and tried to smile. He hoped this time he would be more likable. But for a child who had never smiled before, the forced smile looked strange. He tried to maintain the smile, hoping to buy some food. Unexpectedly, the shopkeeper mistook David for looking for the restaurant. restroom. David, being too hungry, didn't care what anyone thought. He pointed directly at the counter and said he wanted this, that, and a few more items. He asked the owner to wrap everything up for him. The owner thought David was a VIP customer, but when he learned David only had 2 coins, the owner made fun of him and became angry. He sarcastically suggested David buy the whole shop and take him and his wife and children home to support them all. David turned and walked away dejectedly. Meanwhile, the book with the yellow and white cover in the display case silently witnessed his falls and subsequent rise. The image of the happy mother and son on the street always reminded him of his own mother, because if he still had a family, perhaps he wouldn't be wandering hungry and thirsty on the streets like this. All this time, through storms and rain, he had to bear the burden of painful memories alone. With each raindrop, the memories became clearer. Before closing her eyes, his mother weakly called his name. John was right. As long as he lived, everything could change. He had to deliver the letter to Denmark to find out who the man was. Thinking this, David continued on his way. Not far from town, he encountered a couple arguing loudly because their car had run out of gas and was stuck in the middle of the road. Neither of them would walk to the nearest gas station, so kind-hearted David volunteered to run the errand. David carried the gas can to the gas station, then climbed onto the gas station attendant's small motorcycle and rode back with him. Along the way, David spread his arms wide behind him like a young bird learning to spread its wings. In that moment, his heart began to waver. Perhaps there were still good things waiting for him out there. After handing over the gas can to the 2 men, David received a generous payment. This time, he not only got a full meal, but also bought a large bag full of food. After eating, he continued on his journey. He crossed a sun-drenched forest trail, then collapsed from exhaustion and fell asleep. Soon after, cute gray rabbit woke him. Guided by the little rabbit, he once again determined his direction. He trudged on a little further. He arrived at a vast sunflower field. The sea of golden flowers remained vibrant despite the dark clouds, breathtakingly beautiful. Before that scene, the gloom on David's face gradually dissipated. Crossing another vast, labyrinthine forest, he saw a girl like an angel playing with 2 other boys in the sunlight. The children possessed a joy he couldn't understand. Their home was a luxurious, magnificent manor. David climbed the wall to peek inside, but he was pulled down and beaten. He struggled free from the man's grip and ran. Only when he reached the forest by the water's edge did he realize blood was flowing from his nose. He was disgusted by the blood, a symbol of hatred and hurt, and tried to wash it away. But even with the most precious bar of soap, he couldn't wash away the red stain in his heart. He was angry and helpless. He threw the soap into the water. Before, whenever he faced difficulties, he always turned to John. John had told him that only by being alive could things change. So why shouldn't he use his own life to try and escape? But each time, John confessed that he was afraid. They didn't want to live in fear anymore. And now David couldn't understand why. Even though he was out, the fear kept rising in waves. Before he could even think clearly, cries for help rang out from the burning log cabin behind him. David rushed into the flames without hesitation to save the girl trapped inside. That girl was Maria, the daughter of the castle owner. Thanks to her, he was taken to live temporarily in the castle. Maria sincerely thanked him, for his willingness to risk his life to save her was a noble act of faith. Maria's angelic smile helped David understand the meaning of a smile. From then on, he gradually let go of his guard and anxiety. He began to open his heart to this world. The boy who had hit David the day before turned out not to be a bad person. Because David was sneaking around, the boy mistook him for a thief. When he learned that David had saved his sister, he sincerely apologized. Just as John had said, malice often arises from differences. David's strange actions easily led to misunderstandings, but Maria's outstretched hand dispelled all doubts. That warm feeling of trust was something David had always longed for, and also helped him understand that he needed to learn to fit in. However, he still couldn't completely trust her. He still wondered if such good things truly existed in the world. So he told Maria that he had witnessed too much horror. This made her think that he knew nothing about good things. Perhaps she wanted him to understand the world more fully. She led him into her father's study. The room was filled with books and drawings that captivated David. The globe, in particular, intrigued him. He asked where Denmark was. Then he learned that going straight north from there would cross Switzerland and Germany. Just then, Maria's parents entered. They were eager to know where the brave boy David's homeland was. But the familiar gesture of the master inadvertently frightened David. David understood that they had no ill intentions. It was just that he didn't know how many baths he would need to wash away the painful memory. Looking at the bar of soap in front of him, he suddenly remembered the cause of the tragedy years ago when he secretly stole a bar of soap. He only wanted everyone in the camp to be able to bathe and be clean. Unexpectedly, that action sparked a bloody conflict. The officer decided to kill someone as a warning. David clutched the bar of soap in his hand, trembling uncontrollably. John snatched the soap from David's hand. The officer witnessed everything, leaving John with no other option. They simply raised their guns and finished him off. The gunshot that took John's life brought David back to reality. He understood that he had to get to Denmark as soon as possible. He carried the responsibility and hopes of everyone in the camp on his shoulders. He changed into clean clothes, placed the St. Elizabeth card beside Maria's pillow, and hoped the saint would protect the kind and beautiful girl. He felt unworthy of such good things, so he continued his journey to Denmark. Heading north, he arrived at a bustling city. Unexpectedly, the class struggle there was even more intense. Looking at protesters, he didn't understand why they were doing so, but he was still drawn into the chaos. A soldier mistook David for a dissident and arrested him, shoving him into a prisoner transport vehicle. David tried to take out the letter to reassure himself, but the seal had been broken, making him think his mission had failed. Unexpectedly, inside the letter were his identification papers. They clearly stated his identity. The lost child finally knew who he was. Once again, he resolved to complete his mission. Just as the soldier was struggling with the crowd outside, David quickly wrapped a bandage around his arm and bolted the door. When the soldier lunged to grab David, he managed to run to the other side of the road. At this moment, he had come to Denmark not just to deliver a letter, but also to find his own freedom. Though exhausted from running, he managed to force a relieved smile. Just then, a car horn blared behind him. He turned and recognized the sailor who had helped him escape. Perhaps luck was finally smiling upon him. He was given another free ride. He arrived safely in Milan. He parted ways with the sailor and continued on his way to his destination. After another long journey across mountains and passes, he reached a picturesque lake. There, he met an old woman sitting and painting, her eyes the keen eye of an artist. With just a glance, Sophie noticed a sadness on David's face that was unlike that of a child his age. That emotion brought pen in her hand back to life, and so David became the model for the new painting. Seeing David sitting silently like a statue, Sophie gently told him he could talk while she painted, assuring him of her skill. David, however, awkwardly replied that he didn't know what to say. Sophie sighed helplessly, but respected his silence. She also wanted to invite him to her home for lunch, but unfortunately, her house was on the other side of the border, in Swiss territory. David found this perfectly fitting, as the next leg of his journey to Denmark was Switzerland, so he readily accepted and got into Sophie's car. Along the way, she asked if his parents were worried about him traveling alone. Seeing his reluctance to answer, she didn't press the matter further. Soon, they arrived at the border checkpoint. Seeing the soldiers in uniform checking documents, he suddenly felt tense. He stammered that he didn't have any papers and wanted to get out of the car. Sophie understood David's confusion and reassured him that the checks weren't too strict here. When the soldier approached to see David's papers, Sophie immediately said he was her nephew. She had forgotten to bring her papers because she was in a hurry. David tried to force a smile to smooth things over, but the soldier wouldn't let them go. Sophie jokingly told him to let them through. The boy was only here to overthrow the government and then leave. Hearing this, the soldier burst out laughing and said, "When her nephew takes power, remember to give us a raise." With just one witty remark, she skillfully diffused a dangerous situation. Afterwards, David followed Sophie back to her small house. Looking at the paintings covering the walls, he felt as if his soul had been cleansed. Sophie hung the painting she had just done of David on the wall. Seeing his own dark eyes in the painting, he suddenly wondered if he looked the same in other people's eyes. Sophie, however, simply said that paintings should also be viewed from different angles, such as when she looked at David's portrait. Her first impression of him was that he was a kind but overly serious child, especially those deep eyes, as if hiding an unfathomable sadness. That was all she could see, because his true self was locked away too deeply. In truth, David was just like any other child. If he hadn't experienced so much pain, perhaps he would also dream of beautiful things unknown. Sophie set out a warm meal. At the same time, she proudly showed off her necklace. Inside was a picture of her son. Years ago, a plague had ravaged Europe and taken her little son. Since then, only this cat had been her companion. David had never seen a real cat before. He was surprised by its soft body. He immediately buried his face in its fur. He wanted to hug tightly to this one source of warmth in the world. Looking at the gentle boy before her, the old woman couldn't help but remember her own son. She wanted to know more about his family. He let go of the cat and looked up at his own trembling footsteps reflected on the wall. Then he covered his mouth and said he had no family. He quickly corrected himself, saying his home was a circus. Sophie didn't ask any more questions, but gently said that if he had nowhere else to go, he could stay there tonight. David didn't dare stay any longer, but Sophie said she truly hoped she could help him. Hearing this, he pleaded with her never to take him back there. She didn't find it strange at all, but gently comforted him, saying she would help him step by step. He didn't need to tell her any secrets. She assured him he would always be safe here, and no one would be able to take him away. In Sophie's warm embrace, David suddenly realized he was truly free. He finally shed his tough exterior, threw himself into her arms, and sobbed uncontrollably. Since escaping from the camp, she's the only person who hasn't asked about his past. That night, David had a rare, peaceful sleep. No more haunting nightmares. Instead, he dreamt of his mother gently kissing his forehead. The next morning, David went outside with Sophie. The scenery was breathtaking. A gentle breeze blew, making one feel comfortable. Looking at everything, David exclaimed that his friend had once told him he couldn't trust anyone. Hearing this, Sophie seemed to understand. She realized why David's face had been so cold from their first meeting. She tried to help him emerge from the darkness in his heart, because if he didn't trust anyone, life would have no meaning. Most people are good. Everyone has their own family and friends. Even though bad people exist in the world, he shouldn't let that prevent him from seeing the good in others, nor should he let himself become lost in life, because if he did, his life would only become a mess. Sophie wanted David to experience the good things for himself, so she told him to take a walk around the area, and they would meet at the library later. For the first time, David walked not just to escape. It was then that he saw a familiar book with a yellow and white cover. But before he could run over to ask the name of the book, the person carrying it got into a car and drove away. From the church, a solemn hymn echoed. A longing for blessings drew David inside. He pushed open the church door and walked slowly in. But what he didn't expect was an officer following him and standing right beside him. The gun slung over his hip made David feel as if he were about to be dragged back into painful memories. Remembering Sophie's words, he tried to lift his head and softly greeted the officer. Unexpectedly, that stern face broke into a smile. The officer also blessed David. At that moment, the memory of the bar of soap came back to him in full force. The officer in the camp had seen David take the bar of soap, but he quickly signaled John to protect David. He turned his gun towards John. Later, the officer was transferred out of the camp. He could no longer secretly look after David, so he devised a meticulous escape plan for David. The officer personally gave David a letter containing all the information about him. However, in his panic, David buried this memory deep within himself. Amidst the chanting of prayers in the church, David finally let go of his defenses. There are evils in this world, but there are also many good things. Only when people dare to let go of the past can they embrace themselves and the world in a better way. David arrived at the town library on time. There, he encountered the familiar book with the yellow and white cover. Thanks to Sophie's introduction, David learned that the book was titled Journey and Sorrow. The author was a Bulgarian woman, recounting her life after the war. Her husband and son were murdered. The soldier assigned to arrest her that year was her childhood friend. Thanks to his help, she escaped. Afterwards, she changed her name, went into hiding, and lived in Denmark. She became a writer. When he saw the author's photograph on the back of the book, memories buried deep in David's mind suddenly flooded back. That was the person he longed for day and night, the one who always appeared in his dreams. This made David almost unable to believe what was happening. He understood that the officer who had protected him was the soldier his mother had mentioned, the one who had told him to take the papers and travel north to bring him back to her. Sophie learned the truth and immediately took David to the police station. With the support of the local authorities, David ended his arduous journey. After saying goodbye to Sophie at the airport, David boarded a flight to Denmark. He was no longer afraid of strangers. On the plane, David seemed to see John for the last time. John smiled and nodded slightly, as if giving him hope for a better life. David finally set foot on Danish soil. When he saw the woman in the red dress walking towards him, he couldn't suppress pent-up longing in his heart after so many years of separation. Finally, they embraced tightly. The film ends here. Goodbye, and see you in the next videos.